Something is different about Caitlin Clark, and it's not something you can see in the box score, the stat sheet, or even the highlight reels that normally define her dominance. It's something far more uncomfortable. Something in her face, in her silence, in the way she pauses just a second too long before answering questions she has already answered 100 times before. Because for weeks now, the Indiana Fever star's been living in a loop she never asked for. Same questions, same framing, same narrative being pushed over and over again like the league is trying to define her instead of letting her define herself. And at first, she handled it the way stars are supposed to handle it, calm, composed, patient. But patience has a limit, and the cameras caught it. It starts subtle, a shift in her eyes, a tighter jaw, a breath that feels slightly heavier than usual before she speaks. Then the tone changes, still polite, still controlled, but now edged with something sharper underneath. Frustration. Not loud, not explosive, but dangerous in a completely different way. Because when Caitlin Clark finally snaps, it doesn't look like chaos, it looks like clarity turning into irritation. And in that moment, sitting in front of reporters asking the same recycled questions about her role, her usage, her adjustments, something inside her starts to crack just enough for the world to notice. And what she says next, or doesn't say, might be the moment everything around her starts to shift in a way the WNBA was not prepared for at all. To understand why Caitlin Clark's frustration is starting to show through the surface, you have to understand the pressure cooker she has been living in since the moment she entered the WNBA. Because this was never just about basketball. From day one, it was about expectations so massive they stopped feeling human. She didn't arrive as a normal rookie. She arrived as a phenomenon. A player who didn't just bring attention to the league, but completely reshaped its visibility overnight. Every arena she stepped into became a national event. Every possession became analysis. Every mistake became a headline. And every success became a debate instead of a celebration. At first, it looked like admiration. The league was booming, ratings were rising, and Caitlin Clark was being credited as the face of a new era. But underneath that celebration, something more complicated started forming. Because attention in sports is never neutral. It creates pressure. It creates comparison. It creates narratives that players don't control. And for Clark, that meant every aspect of her game began to be dissected through layers she never asked for. Her passing ability, her scoring volume, her defensive adjustments, her usage rate, her fit within systems, her chemistry with teammates, all of it became constant conversation. But the most persistent storyline was not about her performance. It was about her role. Whether she should have the ball more, whether she should play off ball, whether she should adjust to veterans or the system should adjust to her, whether she should be a primary creator or a hybrid piece in a more structured offense. And that's where the tension began to build. Because Caitlin Clark has always played with identity, with rhythm, with control over tempo. She is not a passive player. She is an engine. Someone who dictates how the game flows, how possessions unfold, how defenses react. But the narrative around her started shifting away from what she is and toward what she should become. And that shift is where emotional friction begins. Inside the Indiana Fever organization, there was constant discussion about optimization, about spacing, about balancing ball-handling duties, about reducing pressure. On paper, it all sounded strategic, logical, even necessary against elite defensive pressure. But in reality, every time that conversation made it into press conferences, it reinforced the same public message. Caitlin Clark's role is still being figured out. And that message repeated long enough starts to feel like doubt. Meanwhile, the media cycle didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Every post-game interview became another opportunity to revisit the same topics. Every answer she gave was measured, analyzed, and often taken out of context to fuel the next debate. And Clark, known for her competitiveness, her intensity, her emotional connection to the game, was forced into a position where restraint became her default setting. But restraint is not the same as acceptance. Inside that calm exterior, frustration has been accumulating slowly, not in explosive moments, but in quiet ones, in repeated questions, in predictable narratives, In the feeling that no matter what she does on the court, the conversation keeps circling back to the same idea: adjustment. And that is where the emotional history becomes important, because Caitlin Clark has never been a player who thrives on being redefined. She thrives on defining the game herself. She thrives on rhythm, aggression, confidence, and control. When that control is repeatedly discussed as something she must share, modify, or limit, it creates a psychological tension that doesn't disappear easily. And now, after weeks of media cycles, tactical debates, and constant repetition of the same storyline, that tension is no longer invisible. It is starting to surface, not as a breakdown, not as a controversy, but as something far more telling: a visible shift in energy, a subtle emotional edge, and the beginning of a moment the entire league is starting to feel, even if they don't fully understand it yet. Because what happens next in this environment isn't just about basketball adjustments anymore. It's about how long someone like Caitlin Clark can stay silent while the narrative keeps speaking louder than she does. The moment everything shifts isn't loud. It doesn't come with an outburst, a dramatic exit, or a viral confrontation. It happens in a press room filled with flashing cameras, tired questions, and a player who has heard the same narrative so many times that it starts to feel like background noise she can no longer ignore. Caitlin Clark sits down, adjusts her posture, and for a brief second, everything looks normal, controlled, professional. The version of her the media is used to. But then the first question lands again, the same framing she has been navigating for weeks. Something about her role. Something about off-ball movement. Something about adjustment. And this time, her reaction is different. There is a pause. Slightly longer than usual. Not dramatic, not obvious to everyone in the room, but enough that anyone paying close attention can feel the shift. Her eyes don't immediately light up like they normally do when talking about basketball. Instead, there's a stillness. A restraint that feels like it's holding something back rather than simply listening. When she finally answers, the tone is calm, but tighter, more controlled, less flowing. The words are correct, technically perfect, but emotionally compressed. It's the kind of response that sounds rehearsed not because it is, but because she is choosing every word carefully instead of letting them flow naturally. And that is the first signal that something has changed. Because Caitlin Clark has never been a robotic speaker. She has always been expressive, on the court, in interviews, in moments where passion leaks through even when she tries to contain it. But now, the containment is becoming visible. And the reporters notice it too. The follow-up question comes quickly, almost as if testing the boundary. Same topic, same angle, same narrative loop. And this time, the response is shorter, sharper. Still polite, but with a subtle edge that wasn't there before. A tone that suggests she is aware of the repetition. A tone that suggests she is no longer interested in pretending it isn't repetitive. And that is where the first shocking twist begins to form, not in what she says, but in how little she is willing to expand on it. Because silence inside answers is sometimes louder than statements. Inside the Fever organization, this moment immediately becomes something more than just another media session. Coaches and staff who have been trying to manage external narratives suddenly see something they were hoping to avoid: emotional fatigue becoming visible in real time. Not anger, not rebellion, but something far more complicated: weariness turning into resistance. And as that press conference continues, the dynamic becomes clearer. Every question about role, usage, or adjustment doesn't just get answered. It gets minimized. Not dismissed, but stripped down to its simplest form. No extra emotion. No extra explanation. Just enough to satisfy the room. Nothing more. And that shift is what makes it dangerous. Because in high-pressure sports environments, the first sign of real tension is not confrontation, it's emotional reduction. When a player stops expanding their answers, stops feeding narrative loops, and starts protecting their mental space in real time, it signals a boundary being formed. But the media, knowingly or not, pushes again. Another question. Same topic. Same framing. And this time, something almost imperceptible happens. A slight exhale. A micro-expression. A moment where the professional mask stays on, but the emotional temperature rises just enough to be felt. And for the first time, it becomes clear this is no longer just about basketball strategy discussions. It is about narrative exhaustion. And that is the first twist no one fully acknowledges yet, the realization that Caitlin Clark is not just responding to questions, she is reacting to pressure that has been building far longer than the press room itself. But what nobody in that room knows yet is that this moment is only the beginning. Because once that emotional boundary starts forming, the next interaction won't look like restraint anymore. It will look like something the league, the media, and the fans are not prepared to interpret correctly at all. By the next media availability, the energy around Caitlin Clark feels noticeably different, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a quiet, almost uncomfortable shift that only becomes obvious when you compare it to everything that came before. The questions are still the same, the setting is still familiar, but the responses are no longer flowing the way they used to. And that is where escalation begins. Reporters lean into the storyline even harder now. The framing becomes more persistent, almost repetitive on purpose. Off-ball usage, role adjustment, system fit. The same narrative dressed in slightly different language, as if repetition itself might eventually force a more revealing answer. But Caitlin Clark is no longer engaging with it the same way. Her answers are still respectful, still professional, but there is a noticeable compression in her communication. Fewer details, less elaboration. A clear shift from explaining to responding. And in high-level sports environments, that difference is everything. Because explaining invites conversation, responding shuts it down. And then the second major twist begins to surface. Not through anything she says directly, but through what the media starts doing with her tone. Clips begin circulating online. Short segments of press conference answers. Cropped reactions. Close-up shots of her face between questions. And suddenly, the narrative shifts away from basketball strategy entirely and moves into something more emotional. Is she frustrated? Is she irritated? Is she being tested too much? Is the system overwhelming her? The internet does what it always does. It fills in emotional blanks with interpretation. And that is where escalation becomes uncontrollable. Because once emotion becomes the focus instead of context, every small moment becomes evidence. A pause becomes tension. A short answer becomes frustration. A neutral expression becomes dissatisfaction. And Caitlin Clark, whether she intends it or not, becomes the center of a psychological narrative she never publicly confirmed. Inside the Indiana Fever organization, this growing noise is impossible to ignore. Coaches see the clips. Staff see the discussions. Players see how quickly harmless media sessions are being reframed into emotional analysis pieces. And slowly, the environment around the team begins to feel heavier, not because of what is happening internally, but because of how everything externally is being interpreted. And then comes the second twist that changes the tone completely. A post-game interaction goes viral, not because of anything explosive, but because of how minimal it is. A simple exchange. A short answer. A quick exit from the media area. No controversy in the traditional sense, but enough ambiguity for the internet to create one. Within hours, the clip is everywhere. Commentary accounts start labeling it as visible frustration. Sports shows begin analyzing her body language shift. Fan discussions split into completely opposite interpretations, some calling it maturity and focus, others calling it emotional fatigue and pressure. But the truth is, the moment itself is not new. What is new is the attention being placed on it. And that is the second twist. The realization that Caitlin Clark is no longer just being covered as a player, she is being studied as a narrative. Every expression becomes content. Every answer becomes debate fuel. Every interaction becomes a piece of a larger story that is being written in real time by millions of people who are not in the room. And the more that happens, the more pressure builds, not from basketball expectations, but from constant interpretation. Inside this environment, even neutral behavior starts to feel loaded. And that is where escalation reaches its most dangerous phase so far. Because now, the question is no longer about her role on the court. It is about how long she can exist in a space where everything she does is turned into meaning she never intended to create. And as the noise continues to grow online and inside the league ecosystem, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This situation is no longer about isolated media questions anymore. It is becoming something far larger, something that is starting to shape how every single moment she is next will be perceived. By now, the conversation around Caitlin Clark has moved far beyond a simple media narrative. It has spilled into something much bigger, something louder, something far more uncontrollable. What started as repetitive questions in press conferences has now turned into a full-scale public debate about her emotions, her body language, and even her long-term fit within the Indiana Fever system. And the fallout is immediate. Social media becomes the first battlefield. Every clip gets reposted, slowed down, zoomed in, and dissected frame by frame. A blink becomes signs of frustration. A pause becomes emotional fatigue. A short answer becomes subtle rebellion. Suddenly, people who have never stepped inside a professional locker room are analyzing psychological states based on 10-second video fragments. And that is where the emotional fallout begins to intensify. Because Caitlin Clark is no longer just being discussed as a player, she is being interpreted as a feeling, a reaction, a storyline. Fans split instantly into opposing sides. One group argues that she is simply tired of repetitive questioning and media overreach. They say any elite competitor would feel the same under constant narrative pressure, especially when every answer gets turned into a headline. To them, this is not frustration, it is focus being misread as emotion. But the opposing group sees something else entirely. They believe the pressure is starting to show. That the constant spotlight, the expectations, the tactical debates, and the endless comparisons are slowly accumulating into visible tension. Not a breakdown, but a buildup. A quiet psychological strain that leaks through in subtle moments. And the more both sides argue, the louder the situation becomes. Sports shows jump in next. Analysts begin replaying her press conference clips repeatedly, breaking down tone shifts, facial expressions, and word choices as if they contain hidden meaning. Every segment adds another layer of interpretation. Every panel discussion amplifies the emotional framing. And without any new statement from Caitlin Clark herself, the narrative continues to grow on its own momentum. Inside the Indiana Fever environment, the fallout is felt differently. For coaches and teammates, what is happening externally does not always match internal reality. Inside the facility, the focus remains on preparation, adjustments, and performance. But they are also aware that outside perception is beginning to attach emotional weight to every small interaction. That creates a new kind of pressure, one that does not come from basketball, but from interpretation. Even neutral behavior is no longer neutral once it leaves the building. And that is where the emotional fallout becomes more complex. Because Caitlin Clark is not reacting publicly in a dramatic way. She is not escalating anything. She is not feeding controversy. But the absence of escalation itself is being turned into a story. Silence becomes analysis. Composure becomes debate. Professionalism becomes scrutiny. And that is the core of the fallout. How quickly perception can separate from intention in a hyper-analyzed sports environment. As the noise continues to build, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The story is no longer about what is being said in press conferences. It is about what people believe those press conferences mean. And once meaning becomes the focus instead of reality, control over the narrative starts slipping away from the person at the center of it. But what no one fully realizes yet is that this entire wave of emotional interpretation is leading towards something even bigger, something that will push Caitlin Clark into a moment where silence, answers, and emotion all collide in a way the public is not ready to fully understand. At this point, the story has taken on a life of its own. What began as repetitive media questions has now evolved into a full-blown narrative war about Caitlin Clark's emotional state, her role within the Indiana Fever, and the meaning behind every subtle expression she makes in public. But the final twist doesn't come from another press conference clip or another viral breakdown online. It comes from what happens when the conversation around her starts influencing the conversation inside the organization itself. Because behind the scenes, the Fever are no longer just dealing with basketball preparation. They are now managing perception pressure. Every media angle is being monitored. Every clip circulating online is being seen. And every interpretation of Caitlin Clark's behavior is beginning to circle back into the building. And that changes everything. Reports from inside the environment, still unverified, still speculative, but widely discussed, suggest that internal conversations have started to shift focus away from tactics and toward communication management. Not because of conflict, but because of amplification. The idea that something small externally can become something much larger within hours. And that is where the twist lands. Because Caitlin Clark, according to the growing narrative, is not just reacting to questions anymore. She's reacting to how those questions are being turned into a story about her emotional state. A story she never asked for. A story she is not actively feeding. A story that continues to expand even in her silence. And that is the contradiction at the center of everything. The more composed she stays, the more people analyze her composure. The more controlled her answers are, the more those answers are broken down for hidden meaning. The more professional she remains, the more her professionalism itself becomes the subject of debate. It creates a loop that has no natural exit. And that is why the final moments feel heavier than everything that came before. Because in this environment, even normal behavior stops being interpreted as normal. A short answer becomes a statement. A neutral expression becomes a signal. A lack of emotional reaction becomes emotional data. And Caitlin Clark is now at the center of a narrative machine that continues operating whether she participates in it or not. The final twist is not a breakdown. It is not a confrontation. It is not a public explosion. It is something far more unsettling. It is the realization that the story has started moving independently of her actual behavior. And that is where the cliffhanger takes shape. Because as opening night approaches, the attention is no longer just on her performance, her role, or her adjustment within the system. It is now on how she will look while doing it, how she will respond to the next question, how she will carry herself under cameras that are now searching for meaning in every micro-expression. And the biggest question forming in the background is no longer about basketball strategy at all. It is whether Caitlin Clark can continue operating at elite level while every single moment she has, on or off the court, is being turned into emotional analysis content by a league, a media cycle, and a fan base that cannot stop interpreting her silence. Because the next time she sits in front of those cameras, it will not just be another press conference. It will be another test of how long a player can stay composed while the world keeps trying to define what that composure actually means, and whether the next shift everyone is waiting for is finally about to arrive, or if the narrative is about to escalate even further in a direction no one is prepared for yet. And now the question is sitting right in front of you. Is Caitlin Clark actually frustrated with the media, or is the entire internet just overanalyzing a player who refuses to let outside noise affect her focus? Because on one side, you have people saying this is normal pressure, that every superstar goes through repetitive questioning, narrative fatigue, and constant scrutiny. That what you're seeing is not a breakdown. It's discipline under pressure being mistaken for irritation. But on the other side, you have fans who believe something is building beneath the surface. That the repeated questions, the constant framing, and the non-stop analysis are starting to create visible emotional weight that even a player like Caitlin Clark cannot fully hide forever. And that is where the debate gets interesting. Because the truth is, nobody outside that locker room really knows what she is carrying mentally. All we see are clips, answers, reactions, moments cut out of a much bigger reality that never fully makes it to the public. So now it's your turn. Do you think Caitlin Clark is completely fine and just tired of repetitive media questions? Or do you think the pressure is starting to show in ways the league and fans are not ready to admit yet? Drop your opinion in the comments. And if this situation continues to develop the way it's building right now, the next chapter could look very different from everything we've seen so far.